our next speaker is Professor Johannes Urpelainen. He is an assistant professor of political science at Columbia University. His research focuses on international cooperation and institutions, especially in the field of global environmental governance. He has published numerous papers in academic journals and currently publishing a book, Cutting the Gordian Knot of Economic Reform, When and How International Institutions Help. And the floor is yours, Professor.
So I was given the instruction to talk about the two-way relationship between peace and sustainable development. And I think of those two ways, I think one of them is quite easy to understand. This is the idea that peace is a precondition for sustainable development. Without peace, it's very hard to imagine any kind of a meaningful development. So I'm not going to spend too much time addressing that issue. I consider it fairly obvious that we need to have peace for any kind of meaningful development in different societies. But the other way direction is a little more complicated, and this is the question of to what extent is sustainable development a necessary condition for peace. And on some level, obviously, we can think of if we define sustainability broadly enough, then again, this becomes an obvious issue. So if we say that violence is part of lack of sustainability, then the link between these two issues is obvious. But if we start to think of sustainability in a sort of more narrow sense, thinking of things like the adequacy of resources, the protection of the environment, the protection of both the global and local environmental resources, then the relationship becomes a little less obvious. And in fact, until the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years or so, there was basically no evidence at all that there is a relationship. The most common hypothesis in the studies was that environmental degradation contributes to violence, but surprisingly few studies had found any direct evidence that this is the case. So there were some examples of wars that seemed to be driven by environmental degradation, but all of those were contested, and there were always multiple other structural factors in play. So it was very hard to say what was going on. But recently there's been this new literature that's tried to find new ways to look at the link between climate change and conflict, and the evidence there is fairly clear, and that is that climate change is a big contributor to civil wars in the recent years. So if you look at the start of civil wars in the past, let's say 30 to 40 years, when there's a lot of evidence for higher temperatures, you see that they tend to start in years when the temperature is high. And this happens in countries that react to those temperatures the most strongly. So if you think of an El Nino year, when the temperatures go up in Africa, that's when the wars start. If you think of a La Nina year in Africa, there are very few wars that start at that time. So the link between the way we use energy here and what happens in Africa in terms of violence and killing has become a lot stronger in the past 5 to 10 years. And my first kind of policy implication here would be that I think this connection needs to be made clear, that we cannot prevent violence by simply looking at once there already is a conflict. We need to take into account the global aspect, that what we do here is directly related to how many wars there are that the international community needs to deal with in the future. And so that's why I think sustainable development goals should take into account the importance of protecting the environment, not just for its own sake, but also to contribute to peace. On the other hand, there is also increasingly a realization that while there are many things we can do to control climate change and reduce our resource consumption, it's very unlikely that we could completely stop this and go back to what used to be 200, 300 years ago. Even the most optimistic scenarios now predict at least an increase in global temperature of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. So we are going to have to prepare ourselves for a very different world in the coming 100 years. And this means, going back actually to the previous presentation, that the importance of finding new ways to deal with sort of local environmental stress becomes very important. So whenever climate change or other environmental stress creates difficulties in different areas, these become localized effects. So we cannot say on a global scale what is the best way to prepare for, let's say, environmental conflict in different areas. This is always going to be specific to different areas. So I think there's a clear need to take this kind of bottom-up localized preparation into account. And this brings me to my final point, which is that based on what we've seen so far, it seems that the best way to prepare for environmental degradation is to become wealthy. So there is the realization that if you are a very poor country, there is not a lot you can do to prepare yourself. If you are a middle income or a wealthy country, there's a lot of things you can do to deal with things like floods, drought, and so on. So this brings us to this kind of complicated issue where growing wealthy is good for many reasons, reducing poverty. It's also good for preparing for environmental change. But at the same time, as different countries grow wealthy, they also contribute to that environmental change. So that's why I think things like green growth, decarbonization are becoming increasingly important issues also in the global south. So countries like India, I think there's a clear need to find ways to grow wealthy with less environmental stress. And I think we as a global community should support those efforts, because ultimately what happens in India will then influence what happens in Africa, which will influence what happens here, and so on. So I guess we are all in this together, and we need to find ways to deal with both the issues in the north and the issues in the south, and see the connections between those two. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for explaining and discussing this link between the climate change and the conflict. One of the pillars of the sustainable development is the environmental dimension, and I think there is a now in these days there is a clear connection between climate change, environment, and how it affects the peace and conflicts in certain areas. And it certainly needs to be considered in the discussions of the SDGs.